All right, hello anatomy. This is Mrs. Summers here. Today we're going to cover homeostasis. So if you don't have your note sheet open, go ahead and open that up, whether it's in Notability or however you take your notes, because you'll want to follow along. All right, so kind of before we get into an example and look at a feedback loop, let's talk about how do we define homeostasis, right? So there's a good chance that you've heard the term homeostasis. Maybe it's in biology class or back in middle school. So if we define it, homeostasis is defined as maintaining a constant internal environment. Okay, and why is that important? To control chemical reactions within inside our bodies, right? So homeostasis is all about maintaining a stable equilibrium, right? So in order for our body, right, and our organs and our organ systems, right, we talked about the levels of organization already, right? So in order for our body to undergo all of these processes, we need to be at a stable equilibrium and homeostasis in order for that to happen. All right, so if we look at this diagram here, we're going to go through an example of how does homeostasis work. Okay, so we're going to look at an example looking at our normal body temperature. Okay, so if we're at homeostasis, right, we're at normal body temperature, right, then our body is able to perform all the functions that it needs to. Okay, so if some disruption happens, right, and then it's going to lead our body away from that normal body temperature, right, so what is going to happen? Okay, so the normal body temperature is disrupted, and that's going to stimulate our body or create a stimulus reaction. Okay, so here's an example, and we've used this example in the past, and I was debating using it this year because the Minnesota State Fair did not happen due to COVID, but hopefully it brings back some positive memories. Okay, the Minnesota State Fair is always, right, end of August, super hot days. Okay, so thinking about walking around the state fair, super hot, right? What is your body doing, right? So when your body starts to overheat or has that stimulus, right? There's really hot sun, there's lots of people, right? What does your body do? Okay, so within our body and even within our skin, we have lots of receptors, right? So our body is constantly monitoring the external environment and receiving all this information and sending that information to the brain. Okay, so an example, if we're looking specifically at body temperature, right, we have these temperature sensors in our skin, right, and that's going to receive information and send that to the brain. Okay, so here's just a diagram looking at some specific different receptors that are all within our skin, right? So pretty crazy. There's lots of detail within the skin. Okay, so then where exactly in the brain does that go? That's going to go to a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and that's going to basically receive a lot of information and then determine like where in the brain does that information or the sensory information need to go, so that our body can react, right? So here's looking at where the hypothalamus is within the brain. All right, so then once our brain has time to process that information, right? So we're hot, our body is heating up. How can our brain and our body react to then try and cool back down to maintain homeostasis, right? So within the brain, it's going to send these effector messages, right? So then some examples of that, right? Like how does your body react if you start to get hot and overheat, right? So our blood vessels are going to dilate, right? If you guys have ever, when you're hot and your cheeks start to get a little rosy or a little red, right? That's an example of your blood vessels dilating because they're trying to get closer to the surface of your skin so that they can cool down. Okay, and then you'll usually probably start sweating, right? So your sweat glands in your skin are going to increase secretions, right? And that hopefully will help cool you down. Okay, so then that is the response that will, right, trigger increased heat loss, right, via evaporation and radiation, and then hopefully that will bring us back to our normal body temperature. Okay, so that's looking at an example of homeostasis, right? So we have a disruption, right? So homeostasis is the normal, the stable, the equilibrium. We have some sort of disruption or stimulus, right? And then it's going to send the information to the brain. The brain is going to react, right? What do we need to do to get back to that normal state? And, right, so then your body will respond. Okay, and then restore the normal body temp. right? And then if any point you need to pause or maybe rewind or go back to make sure that you get all the notes, right? That's always a good idea. All right, so then getting into feedback, right? There's two types of feedback loops, and I'll give you guys some examples in a second here. So there's positive feedback and negative feedback. So first, if we go over negative feedback, right? So it says the response is opposite of the stimulus, right? So let's say our body temperature is increasing, right? What is our body doing to get it back to normal? So it says the response counters the stimulus, and it goes in the direction of the negative, or negative to the stimulus, right? So that's kind of what I was just saying, when it counters, and it reduces the action of the effectors, right? So once your body starts to cool down, right, you're going to be sweating less, right? You're going to, your cheeks won't be as rosy. Okay, so then another example of a negative feedback loop that's really common that occurs within our body, right, is an example of eating and how that's going to affect our blood sugar level, our blood glucose levels, right? So the stimulus here would be eating, right? So when we're eating, we're putting sugars, we're putting carbohydrates, proteins into our body, right? But really thinking about the sugars, right? So that's going to increase our blood glucose levels, okay? And then from there, right, our body, in the pancreas specifically, is going to be triggered to secrete insulin. Okay, well, and what does insulin do? Insulin is then going to go trigger the liver and muscle cells to take up that blood glucose for storage or use. Okay, and when that is taken up, right, then the blood sugar levels should go back down, and then homeostasis is restored. Okay, so that was our example of negative feedback. Okay, so then the other type of feedback is positive feedback. Okay, so in this case, the response is in the same direction as the stimulus. Okay, it moves the condition away from the normal state, and the response is amplified, right? So amplified means that it just becomes like bigger and bigger. So we'll talk about what are some examples of positive feedback. Okay, so one of the most common examples is looking at childbirth, labor and delivery, right? So the stimulus there is when the baby's head starts to push on the cervix, right? Then that's going to create this positive feedback loop, right? So then the cervix, the nerve impulse is transmitted then to the brain, and then the pituitary gland is then going to secrete oxytocin, right? And oxytocin is a hormone that is going to stimulate uterine contractions, right? So then those contractions are going to get bigger and bigger and stronger until that baby comes out, right? So that's an example of positive feedback. Okay, another example of positive feedback is blood clotting, right? So if you have some sort of injury that, right, affects your blood vessel, there's going to be a response within your immune system to send these clotting factors and platelets to that injured area, right? So the system is going to, or your immune system is going to keep sending these platelets until there's enough that have formed a clot or like a scab, or are able to kind of close that injury, right? So that's another example of positive feedback. All right, so that is it for the homeostasis notes today, right? So again, if you need to go back and review this Google Slides, that should be posted. And otherwise, you feel free to rewind as much as you need to. All right. Have a good one.